own baby shower. When your past walks through the door and shatters everything you thought you knew about your life. Rebecca Sterling had it all. A billionaire husband, a mansion, designer everything. She was living the American dream, or so she told herself. But when her college sweetheart, now a celebrity chef, shows up to cater her baby shower, 10 years of buried secrets and desperate lies are about to explode in the most shocking way possible. What happens when the man you gave up for security confronts the husband who controls every breath you take? What happens when love and possession collide in front of 50 witnesses? And what happens when a single slap changes everything? Not just for Rebecca, but for the innocent child she's carrying. This is the story of a woman who thought she was safe, a marriage that was really a prison, and the moment when everything she'd built came crashing down in the most public way imaginable. Get ready for a tale of betrayal, courage, and the price of choosing security over your soul. This is the baby shower that changed everything. The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor as Rebecca Sterling realized her past had just walked into her baby shower. She stood frozen in her designer maternity dress, 8 months pregnant with what should have been the happiest celebration of her life, turning into her worst nightmare. The crystal fragments sparkled like tears on the pristine, white marble of the Sterling family estate, and Rebecca couldn't help but think they looked exactly like her carefully constructed perfect life was about to look. Oh my goodness, let me get that cleaned up right away. Amanda Foster, the event coordinator, rushed over with a small dustpan. Are you all right, Mrs. Sterling? Rebecca nodded mutely, her hand instinctively moving to protect her rounded belly. She wasn't all right. She hadn't been all right for months, maybe even years. But she'd become an expert at pretending otherwise. The baby shower was everything Dorothy Sterling, her millionaire ex-husband's mother, had envisioned. 50 of the most influential women in the city mingled beneath crystal chandeliers, their designer outfits and perfectly applied makeup, creating a scene straight from a luxury magazine. White and gold decorations adorned every surface, and an elaborate dessert table stretched along one wall, waiting for the celebrity chef Dorothy had hired to make his grand entrance. That celebrity chef was Marcus Hayes. Her Marcus. Well, not her Marcus anymore. He'd stopped being hers 10 years ago when she'd chosen security over love, comfort over passion, and Jonathan Sterling over the boy who'd taught her that food could be poetry. Rebecca, darling, you look absolutely radiant. Claire Montgomery, her best friend and maid of honor, appeared at her side with a concerned expression. Though you seem a bit pale, are you feeling okay? Before Rebecca could answer, Dorothy's commanding voice rang across the ballroom. Ladies, may I have your attention, please? Our surprise celebrity chef has arrived, and I know you're all going to be absolutely thrilled. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't seen Marcus in person since their devastating breakup in college. She'd followed his career from afar, watching him become one of the most celebrated chefs in the country. His signature restaurant empire built on the foundation of comfort food elevated to gourmet heights. She'd even watched his cooking shows, torturing herself with memories of lazy Sunday mornings when he'd make her breakfast in their tiny college apartment, explaining each ingredient like it was precious treasure. The catering staff began setting up their stations with military precision. Rebecca recognized Marcus immediately, even though he'd filled out since college. His dark hair now professionally styled instead of perpetually messy, his lean frame broader with the confidence of success. He wore chef whites that looked more like armor than work clothes, and when he smiled at Dorothy, Rebecca felt her heart crack just a little more. He hadn't seen her yet. Dorothy was handling all the introductions, playing the perfect hostess, while Marcus surveyed the setup with the keen eye of a professional. Rebecca knew she should excuse herself, find some way to avoid the inevitable confrontation, but her feet felt rooted to the marble floor. The menu today will be absolutely divine, Dorothy continued, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted to remind everyone of the Sterling family's wealth and influence. Chef Hayes has prepared some of his most celebrated dishes exclusively for us. Marcus began directing his team with quiet authority, and Rebecca was transported back to their college kitchen where he'd taught her the difference between cooking and creating. He'd had the same focused intensity then, the same way of making everyone around him want to do their best work. Rebecca, Claire's voice seemed to come from very far away. Honey, you're scaring me. "You look like you've seen a ghost." That was exactly what she'd seen. The ghost of the woman she used to be. The woman who'd believed that love was enough to build a life on. The woman who'd trusted her heart instead of her head. At least until the moment she'd chosen to break both their hearts for the promise of financial security. Her marriage to Jonathan Sterling had been everything she'd thought she wanted. He was successful, stable, and completely devoted to her. At least, that's what she'd told herself during their whirlwind courtship. It wasn't until after the wedding that she'd begun to understand the difference between devotion and possession, between protection and control. Now, 8 months pregnant and feeling more isolated than ever, she was face to face with the road not taken. Marcus represented everything she'd given up: passion, creativity, and the kind of love that made you want to be better than you were. The irony wasn't lost on her that Dorothy had chosen him specifically. Her millionaire ex-husband's mother never did anything without multiple motives, and Rebecca was beginning to suspect this wasn't the coincidence Dorothy had presented it as. "I think," Rebecca said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to sit down for a moment." But even as Claire guided her toward one of the elegant chairs arranged around the room, Rebecca couldn't take her eyes off Marcus. He was here, in her world, cooking for the life she'd built without him. The collision of her past and present felt like a natural disaster she could see coming, but was powerless to stop, as if sensing her stare. Marcus looked up from his prep station. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, and Rebecca saw the exact moment recognition hit him. His hands stilled on the knife he'd been using, his professional composure wavering for just a second before he recovered. But that second was enough. In it, she saw 10 years of questions, hurt, and something that looked dangerously like hope. The baby shower continued around them, guests chatting and laughing, unaware that the foundation of Rebecca's carefully constructed world had just shifted beneath her feet. She pressed her hand to her belly, feeling her daughter's strong kicks, and wondered if this child would grow up in a world built on truth or one founded on the beautiful lies Rebecca had been telling herself for years. Marcus turned back to his work, but Rebecca knew it was too late. The dam holding back 10 years of regret and what-ifs had cracked, and she could feel the flood coming. The worst part was that somewhere, buried beneath the panic and fear, was a tiny spark of something she'd almost forgotten existed. Relief. For the first time in years, she felt like she was about to stop pretending. Even if it destroyed everything she'd built, at least it would be real. Rebecca barely made it to the powder room before the panic attack hit in full force. Her chest tightened like someone had wrapped steel bands around her lungs, and she gripped the marble countertop so hard her knuckles went white. The face staring back at her from the ornate mirror looked like a stranger, pale, terrified, and so very tired. She slid down the wall onto the plush carpet, her maternity dress pooling around her like a silk tent. The baby kicked frantically, as if sensing her mother's distress, and Rebecca tried to remember the breathing exercises Dr. Patricia Webb had taught her for managing pregnancy anxiety. But this wasn't pregnancy anxiety. This was the reckoning she'd been avoiding for 10 years. The memories crashed over her like waves, each one more vivid than the last. Marcus at 23, flower in his dark hair, teaching her to make pasta from scratch in their cramped college apartment. His hands guiding hers as they kneaded the dough, his voice soft in her ear as he explained the science behind gluten development, the way he'd kiss the tip of her nose when she got it right, like she'd just discovered the secret to eternal happiness. "You're going to be an amazing food writer someday," he'd told her after reading her first blog post. "You understand that food isn't just about taste. It's about love, memory, connection. You get that." She'd believed him then, believed in herself, in their future, in the restaurant they dreamed of opening together. He would cook, she would write, and they'd build something beautiful from their shared passion, until her senior year, when reality had come knocking in the form of student loans, uncertain futures, and her parents' well-meaning warnings about the instability of the food industry. Marcus had been accepted to a prestigious culinary program in Paris, a full scholarship that would have launched his career, but meant 2 years apart. "Come with me," he'd begged the night before his departure. "We'll figure it out. We always do." But Rebecca had been scared. Scared of being broke, scared of failing, scared of building a life on something as intangible as love and dreams. So she'd told him to go alone, that she needed to focus on her practical degree in business communications. She'd told him they were too young, too different, too impractical. She'd told him everything except the truth that Professor Jonathan Sterling, her macroeconomics teacher, had offered her an internship at his consulting firm and made it clear that the position came with the possibility of something more. Security, stability, a life where she'd never have to worry about making rent or choosing between groceries and textbooks. Marcus had left for Paris with a broken heart, and Rebecca had started dating Jonathan 2 weeks later. It had felt like a betrayal even then, but she'd convinced herself she was being smart, practical, mature. 5 years later, when Jonathan had proposed with a ring that cost more than Marcus's annual salary at the time, she'd told herself she was happy. When she'd given up her food blog to become the perfect corporate wife, she'd told herself it was what she wanted. When she'd signed the prenuptial agreement that essentially made her a well-kept prisoner, she'd told herself it was just a precaution. Now, sitting on a bathroom floor in a dress that cost more than most people's monthly salary, she realized she'd been lying to herself for a decade. A soft knock interrupted her spiral. "Rebecca, honey, are you in there?" Claire's voice carried genuine concern. "I'm fine," Rebecca called out, though her voice cracked on the words. "Just needed a minute. I'm coming in." The door opened, and Claire appeared in her elegant navy dress, her expression immediately shifting to alarm when she saw Rebecca on the floor. "Oh, sweetie, what's wrong?" Claire had been her roommate in college, the one person who'd known about her relationship with Marcus, who'd watched their love story unfold and then witnessed its devastating conclusion. She'd never said much about Rebecca's marriage to Jonathan, but her careful politeness whenever his name came up had spoken volumes. "He's here," Rebecca whispered. "Marcus is here." Claire's eyes widened in understanding. "The celebrity chef Dorothy hired." "Oh, Rebecca, I can't do this. I can't face him. Not now. Not like this." Rebecca gestured helplessly at her pregnant form, her designer life, the evidence of everything she'd chosen instead of him. Claire knelt down beside her, careful not to wrinkle her dress. "Tell me what happened between you two. I mean, really happened. You never told me the whole story." Rebecca laughed bitterly. "The whole story is that I was a coward. He wanted us to take a leap of faith together, and I chose to jump into Jonathan's arms instead. It was more complicated than that, and you know it. You were 22, broke, and terrified of ending up like your parents." Rebecca's parents had been passionate, creative people who'd spent her childhood bouncing between financial crises. Her father was a musician who'd never quite made it. Her mother a painter whose work hung in coffee shops instead of galleries. They'd loved each other desperately, but that love hadn't paid the bills or secured Rebecca's college fund. "I told myself I was being practical," Rebecca said, "but really I was just scared. Scared that loving him meant risking everything, and I'd already watched my parents sacrifice stability for passion my whole childhood. And now she was married to a man who'd grown increasingly controlling as their relationship progressed. Now she lived in a beautiful prison where her every move was monitored, her every decision questioned. Now she was about to have a baby with a man who saw her as a possession rather than a partner. The irony was that Marcus had become everything Jonathan claimed to be successful, wealthy, respected. But more than that, he'd become those things without losing the part of himself that had made her fall in love with him in the first place. She'd watched his interviews, seen how he talked about food with the same passion he'd had at 23. He'd grown into his dreams instead of abandoning them. "Now I realize that I chose safety over authenticity," Rebecca said. "And safety without authenticity is just a prettier prison." Claire helped her to her feet, brushing dust off her dress. "So what are you going to do?" Before Rebecca could answer, Dorothy's voice echoed from the ballroom, amplified by the estate's sound system. "Ladies, our celebrity chef is about to begin his cooking demonstration. Please gather around so you can see his artistry in action." Rebecca met her own eyes in the mirror. She looked like a woman on the verge of making a decision that would change everything. And maybe that's exactly what she was. "I'm going to face my past," she said, "and then I'm going to figure out if I have the courage to change my future." As they walked back toward the ballroom, Rebecca felt her daughter kick again, and she wondered if the baby could sense the seismic shift about to happen in their world. For the first time in months, The kicks felt less like distress and more like encouragement, as if her daughter was telling her it was time to be brave. The question was brave enough for what Rebecca returned to the ballroom just as Marcus began his demonstration, and she was struck by how effortlessly he commanded the room's attention. The Marcus she'd known in college had been talented but uncertain, always second-guessing himself despite his natural gifts. This Marcus moved with the confidence of someone who'd found his place in the world. She positioned herself toward the back of the crowd, hoping to observe without being noticed. But she should have known better. Marcus had always been able to sense her presence in a room, and this time was no different. As he explained his technique for preparing fresh pasta, his eyes found hers and held them for a moment longer than necessary. "The secret to perfect pasta," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room, "isn't just in the technique, it's in understanding that you're creating something meant to bring people together. Every dish should tell a story." Rebecca's breath caught. Those were almost the exact words he'd said to her in their college apartment, the night he'd first told her he loved her. "What story are you telling today?" Chef Hayes asked Margaret Thornton, one of Dorothy's closest friends and the biggest gossip in their social circle. Marcus smiled, but his eyes remained on Rebecca. "Today, I'm telling the story of second chances, of recognizing that sometimes the most important ingredients in life are the ones we think we've lost." Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks. Several women in the crowd murmured appreciatively, but she wondered if anyone else could hear the subtext in his words. This wasn't just a cooking demonstration, it was a conversation, and somehow she'd become an unwilling participant. "The menu today," Marcus continued, beginning to plate the first course, "includes several dishes that hold special meaning for me. This risotto, for example, was inspired by a garden salad I once shared with someone very important to me. Someone who taught me that the simplest ingredients, when combined with care and attention, can create something extraordinary." Rebecca's heart clenched. She remembered that salad, remembered Marcus picking tomatoes and herbs from the tiny garden plot behind their apartment building, remembered how they'd eaten it on a blanket in the park, while he told her about his dreams of opening a restaurant someday. "How romantic," sighed Amanda Foster. "Is there a Mrs. Hayes who inspired these dishes?" "No," Marcus said simply. "The woman who inspired them chose a different path." The casual brutality of that statement hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She pressed her hand to her chest, trying to calm her racing heart. But the baby's increasingly frantic movements made it clear that her distress was affecting both of them. Jonathan appeared at her elbow, his hand settling possessively on the small of her back. "There you are, I was looking for you." His voice carried that particular tone he used when he was displeased but trying to hide it in public. "I was just freshening up," Rebecca murmured, grateful that her husband's arrival provided a distraction from Marcus's pointed storytelling. "You look flushed. Are you feeling all right?" Jonathan's concern sounded genuine, but Rebecca had learned to recognize the calculating look in his eyes. He was always monitoring her physical state, her emotional reactions, filing away information to use later. "I'm fine. Just warm with all these people." Jonathan's grip on her back tightened slightly. "Perhaps we should step outside for some fresh air." "Oh, but we'll miss the demonstration," Rebecca protested weakly. The last thing she wanted was to be alone with Jonathan right now, not when her emotions were so close to the surface. "The chef will understand. Your health and the baby's health are more important than a cooking show." Rebecca glanced toward Marcus and found him watching their interaction with barely concealed concern. For a moment, she saw him as he truly was, not the successful celebrity chef, but the boy who'd once spent an entire night holding her hair back when she'd had food poisoning, who'd made her soup from scratch and fed it to her one spoonful at a time. "Actually," she said, surprising herself with her firmness, "I'd like to stay. Dorothy went to a lot of trouble to arrange this." Jonathan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, whatever you prefer, darling." But his hand remained on her back, a reminder of his presence, his claim on her. Rebecca had learned to read the subtle signs of his displeasure, the slight tension in his jaw, the way his smile never quite reached his eyes, the particular cadence he used when he was planning to address her behavior later in private. Marcus had moved on to preparing the second course, but Rebecca could feel his attention divided between his cooking and her obvious discomfort. When Jonathan made a show of adjusting her shawl, Marcus's knife work became more aggressive, his chopping precise but forceful. "This next dish," Marcus said, "is something I call comfort in crisis. It's based on a simple grilled cheese and tomato soup combination, but elevated with aged Gruyere and a roasted red pepper bisque." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears before she could stop them. That had been their go-to meal during finals week, during her parents' divorce, during any crisis that required comfort food and the kind of love that came without conditions or expectations. "Are you crying?" Jonathan whispered, his voice sharp with concern and something else. Suspicion. "What's wrong with you today?" "Pregnancy hormones," she said quickly. "Doctor, Webb warned me I might get emotional during the third trimester." Some. It was a convenient lie, one that Jonathan accepted because it fit his understanding of pregnancy as a condition that made women temporarily irrational. He relaxed slightly, his proprietary smile returning. But when Rebecca looked up, she found Marcus watching her with an expression of such tenderness and understanding that she had to look away. He'd always been able to read her emotions, and apparently time hadn't changed that. The problem was that now she wasn't sure she wanted to be read, wasn't sure she could handle having someone see past the careful facade she'd constructed. "The final dish," Marcus announced, "is something I've never served before. It's called the Road Not Taken, and it represents all the possibilities we think we've lost, all the dreams we think are beyond our reach." He plated the dish with artistic precision, a delicate piece of salmon wrapped in herbs, surrounded by vegetables that had been transformed into something that looked like a garden in miniature. It was beautiful, but more than that, it was a message. "Sometimes," Marcus said, his eyes finding Rebecca's one more time, "we think we've missed our chance at happiness. But the truth is, it's never too late to choose love over fear, authenticity over security, the life we want over the life we think we should want." The room erupted in appreciative applause, but Rebecca felt like she was drowning. Marcus was offering her something she'd thought was gone forever, the possibility of a different life, a different choice, a different version of herself. The question was whether she had the courage to reach for it, or whether she'd let fear win again. Jonathan's hand tightened on her back, and Rebecca realized that the decision might not be entirely up to her. Her millionaire ex-husband wasn't the type of man who let his possessions walk away, especially not when they were carrying his heir. But for the first time in years, Rebecca found herself wondering what would happen if she tried. As the guests dispersed to sample Marcus's creations, Rebecca found herself cornered by Dorothy Sterling, whose smile had all the warmth of a January morning. "Walk with me, dear," Dorothy said, linking her arm through Rebecca's with deceptive casualness. "I think we need to have a little chat." They moved toward the estate's conservatory, a glass-enclosed garden room that provided privacy while maintaining the illusion of openness. Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs as she wondered how much Dorothy had observed during the cooking demonstration. "That was quite a performance," Dorothy said once they were alone among the orchids and exotic plants. "The chef certainly knows how to tell a story." "He's very talented," Rebecca replied carefully. "You chose well." Dorothy's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Oh, my dear girl, I chose very specifically. Did you think I didn't know about your little college romance?" Rebecca's blood turned to ice. "I don't know what you mean." "Please, give me some credit. When Jonathan first brought you home, I had you investigated thoroughly. Marcus Hayes, your former boyfriend, the one who broke your heart so badly you rebounded into the arms of my son." Dorothy's voice carried the satisfaction of someone playing a winning hand. "Though I suspect the heartbreaking went both ways, didn't it?" Rebecca's mind raced. If Dorothy had known all along, then today wasn't a coincidence. It was a test, a trap, or maybe both. "Why?" Rebecca whispered. "Why would you do this?" "Because I needed to know where your loyalties truly lie. My son is about to become a father, and he's building a political career that could take him to the governor's mansion. Maybe beyond. I won't have his future destroyed by a wife who can't keep her past where it belongs." The conservatory suddenly felt like a greenhouse prison, the humid air thick and suffocating. Rebecca's maternity dress clung to her skin, and she could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cooling system. "You're testing me," Rebecca said, understanding flooding through her like poison. "I'm giving you an opportunity to prove that you made the right choice 10 years ago, that you're committed to this family, To your husband, to the life you've built. Dorothy's voice dropped to a whisper. Because make no mistake, Rebecca, there are consequences for failing this test. What kind of consequences? Dorothy pulled out her phone and scrolled to what looked like a legal document. Your prenuptial agreement, which I insisted Jonathan include several interesting clauses in. Infidelity, for instance, results in complete forfeiture of all assets, including very limited custody rights to any children. Rebecca felt the walls closing in around her. She'd signed that agreement without reading it carefully, trusting Jonathan's assurances that it was just a formality, protection for both of them. She'd been so grateful to be chosen by someone like him, so afraid he'd change his mind, that she'd signed whatever documents his lawyers put in front of her. I haven't been unfaithful, she said weakly. Haven't you? What would you call the way you looked at that chef today? The way you responded to his little performance? You were practically glowing with the memory of better times. Dorothy was right, and they both knew it. Rebecca had been unfaithful, if not in body, then certainly in heart and mind. For 90 minutes, she'd allowed herself to remember what it felt like to be loved for who she truly was, instead of what she represented. I see you understand me, Dorothy continued. Good. Then you'll also understand that any scandal involving my family will result in swift and complete retaliation. You'll find yourself divorced, penniless, and fighting for weekend visitation rights to your own child. The baby chose that moment to kick violently, as if she could sense the threat to their safety. Rebecca wrapped both arms around her belly protectively, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Dorothy. Of course, if you pass this test, if you prove your loyalty, then none of that will be necessary. You'll continue to live as you have, comfortable and secure, raising your daughter in luxury and privilege. And if Marcus tries to contact me, then you'll politely but firmly discourage him. You'll remember that you're a married woman with responsibilities, and you'll act accordingly. Dorothy's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it with satisfaction. Speaking of which, I believe our chef has just asked one of the catering staff to deliver a message to you. Something about wanting to speak privately after the event. Rebecca's heart leaped and plummeted simultaneously. Marcus wanted to talk to her. After 10 years, he still cared enough to risk his professional reputation by mixing business with personal matters. What's it going to be, Rebecca? The past that offers nothing but uncertainty and struggle, or the future that's already been secured for you and your child? Before Rebecca could answer, they heard voices approaching. Jonathan appeared in the doorway with Marcus beside him, and Rebecca realized with growing horror that her worlds were about to collide in the most dangerous way possible. There you are, Jonathan said, his smile tight. Chef Hayes was just telling me how much he's enjoyed preparing for today's event. Apparently, he has some special connection to the menu. Marcus's eyes found Rebecca's, and she saw the exact moment he registered her fear. His professional mask slipped slightly, revealing the man who'd once promised to protect her from anything that could hurt her. The connection is to the food itself, Marcus said carefully. I believe that every dish should have emotional resonance. Today's menu was designed to celebrate new beginnings and the power of taking chances. How philosophically interesting, Dorothy interjected smoothly. Though I've always believed that some chances aren't worth taking, that sometimes a smart choice is to appreciate what you have rather than risk it for something that might not exist. The four of them stood in the conservatory like players in an elaborate chess game, each move carrying the potential for devastating consequences. Rebecca could feel the weight of Dorothy's threat, the possessiveness of Jonathan's presence, and the gravitational pull of Marcus's barely contained emotion. I should get back to my team, Marcus said finally. We still have cleanup to finish. But as he turned to go, he looked at Rebecca one more time, and she saw a question in his eyes that she couldn't answer. Not here, not now, possibly not ever. When Marcus left, Dorothy's smile returned full force. I trust we understand each other now, she said to Rebecca. This was a lovely test, and I hope you'll pass it with flying colors. Jonathan took Rebecca's arm, his touch gentle but inescapable. You look tired, darling. Perhaps we should head home soon. Rebecca nodded, not trusting her voice. As they walked back toward the ballroom, she realized that the baby shower had become something else entirely the moment when her past and future collided. when she learned the true price of the bargain she'd made, and when she discovered that some prisons were too beautiful to escape. The question now was whether she had the strength to try anyway. The remainder of the baby shower passed in a haze of forced smiles and carefully modulated conversations. Rebecca played her part perfectly, thanking guests for their elaborate gifts, posing for photos with her hand resting on her belly, accepting congratulations on her beautiful life with all the grace expected of a sterling wife. But underneath the performance, she felt like a volcano on the verge of eruption. Jonathan had positioned himself as her constant companion, his hand never leaving her back, her arm, or her shoulder. To the casual observer, he looked like the devoted husband protecting his pregnant wife from overexertion. To Rebecca, it felt like being shackled to a charming warden. "You're being very quiet," he murmured as they watched the gift opening ceremony. "Are you sure you're feeling well?" "Just tired," she replied automatically. It was her standard excuse, and usually Jonathan accepted it without question. Pregnancy, in his mind, was a temporary condition that explained away any behavior he found troubling. But today, his scrutiny felt more intense. She could feel him cataloging her reactions, filing away every moment of distraction or distress. Jonathan had built his consulting empire on the ability to read people, to identify their weaknesses and leverage them for maximum advantage. Rebecca was beginning to suspect she'd become his most studied subject. Across the room, Marcus directed his catering staff with quiet efficiency. The cleanup was nearly complete, but Rebecca noticed he'd found reasons to linger, accepting compliments from guests, discussing future bookings with Dorothy, maintaining his professional presence while clearly waiting for something or someone. "The chef certainly made an impression today," Jonathan said, following her gaze. "Several of the ladies have asked about booking him for their own events. He's very talented." "Talented, yes, but also rather presumptuous. Don't you think all that talk about second chances and choosing love over fear? It seemed almost like he was giving advice to someone specific." Rebecca's mouth went dry. "I think he was just being philosophical. Chefs often talk about food in metaphorical terms." Jonathan's hand tightened on her shoulder. "I'm sure you're right. After all, what would a chef know about the real world, about the responsibilities that come with building an actual life, a family, a legacy?" The condescension in his voice made Rebecca wince. This was vintage Jonathan dismissing anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of success, reducing complex human emotions to character flaws or professional inadequacies. "Some of the most successful people I know started with nothing but passion and determination," Rebecca said before she could stop herself. Jonathan turned to look at her fully, his expression shifting from casual interest to sharp focus. "That's a very romantic notion, but passion doesn't pay for private schools or secure political appointments. Passion doesn't build generational wealth." "Maybe not, but it builds other things. Fulfillment, authenticity. The kind of success that comes from doing what you love." "Success that comes from doing what you love," Jonathan repeated slowly. "That sounds like something someone else might have told you once. Someone young and idealistic who didn't understand how the real world works." Rebecca's heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. "I was just making conversation." "Of course you were," but Jonathan's smile had taken on a sharp edge. "It's interesting, though, how being around certain people can bring out old thoughts, old dreams we thought we'd outgrown." Before Rebecca could respond, Dorothy appeared beside them with Margaret Thornton in tow. "Jonathan, darling, Margaret was just telling me about the most fascinating conversation she had with the chef. It seems he's originally from this area, went to the same university as Rebecca, if you can imagine the coincidence." Margaret nodded enthusiastically. "I asked him if he knew you, Rebecca, since you're about the same age, but he said he didn't think you'd remember him. Very modest man." Rebecca felt like she was watching a carefully orchestrated performance, with Dorothy as the director and Margaret as an unwitting actress. Every word was designed to increase the tension, to push Rebecca closer to some invisible line that Dorothy wanted her to cross. "Did he?" Jonathan said conversationally. "How interesting that he would assume you wouldn't remember him. That suggests he remembered you quite clearly." "I meet a lot of people," Rebecca said weakly. "College was a long time ago." "Not that long," Jonathan replied. 10 years isn't that long in the grand scheme of things. People change, of course, but the fundamental connections remain. Don't you think Rebecca realized with growing horror that she was being systematically trapped? Every response she gave was being analyzed, categorized, and filed away for future reference. Jonathan wasn't just suspicious. He was building a case. I think, Dorothy interjected smoothly, that some connections are best left in the past where they belong. Rebecca has built such a beautiful life here, such a secure future. It would be a shame to jeopardize that for the sake of nostalgia. The word jeopardize hung in the air like a threat. Rebecca looked around the room at the women who'd been celebrating her impending motherhood and realized that every one of them would turn on her in an instant if scandal touched the Sterling family. These weren't her friends. They were Jonathan's mother's allies, and their loyalty belonged to power, not to her. As if summoned by her desperation, Claire appeared at her side. "Rebecca, I think I left my purse in the powder room earlier. Would you mind helping me look for it?" It was clearly a rescue mission, and Rebecca grabbed onto it like a lifeline. "Of course, if you'll excuse us." Jonathan's hand lingered on her arm for a moment longer than necessary. "Don't be long. We should head home soon so you can rest." As they walked toward the powder room, Claire whispered, "You look like you're about to have a panic attack. What's going on?" "Dorothy knows about Marcus. She hired him on purpose, to test me, and Jonathan is getting suspicious about why I'm acting strange." "Test you how?" Rebecca quickly explained Dorothy's threats about the prenuptial agreement and custody arrangements. With each word, Claire's expression grew more alarmed. "That's insane. You can't live under that kind of threat." "I don't have a choice. If I leave Jonathan, I lose everything. My daughter would grow up shuttled between her father's mansion and whatever tiny apartment I could afford on my own. And if you stay," Rebecca looked at herself in the powder room mirror. The woman staring back at her looked elegant, polished, successful. She also looked utterly defeated. "If I stay, I continue living a lie. I raise my daughter in a house where love is conditional and control is disguised as protection. I teach her that a woman's security is more important than her happiness. And Marcus goes back to his life, and I go back to pretending mine is enough." Claire was quiet for a long moment. "What if there was a third option?" "What do you mean?" "What if you could find a way to leave without losing your daughter? What if there was a way to prove that Jonathan and Dorothy are the real threats to your child's welfare?" Before Rebecca could ask what she meant, Amanda Foster burst into the powder room, her face flushed with excitement and something that looked like panic. "Rebecca, thank God I found you. You need to see this. Something's happened." She thrust her phone toward them, and Rebecca saw a video playing on the screen. It was footage from the baby shower, but focused on Jonathan during Marcus's cooking demonstration. The audio was crystal clear, and Rebecca could hear every condescending remark Jonathan had made, every subtle put-down, every attempt to belittle Marcus's profession and philosophy. "I was recording the cooking demo for the event portfolio," Amanda explained, "but I accidentally caught this conversation. Listen to what your husband says at the end." Rebecca watched in horror as the video showed Jonathan pulling her aside, his voice clearly audible as he said, "Passion doesn't pay for private schools or secure political appointments. Passion doesn't build generational wealth." But it was what came next that made her blood run cold. After she'd made her comment about fulfillment and authenticity, Jonathan's expression had changed completely. His public mask had slipped for just a moment, revealing something dark and calculating underneath. "Success that comes from doing what you love." His recorded voice said, "That sounds like something someone else might have told you once. Someone young and idealistic who didn't understand how the real world works." The venom in his tone was unmistakable. This wasn't a husband concerned about his wife's well-being. This was a man who saw himself as competing with a ghost, and who was prepared to use his power to eliminate that competition permanently. "Oh my God," Claire whispered. "Rebecca, you need to get out of there. Tonight." But as they stared at the phone screen, Rebecca realized it might already be too late, because the video showed something else. Marcus, standing close enough to have heard every word, his face a mask of protective fury that suggested he wasn't going to let this slide. The pressure cooker was about to explode, and Rebecca was standing at ground zero. Rebecca returned to the ballroom on unsteady legs, Amanda's video playing on repeat in her mind. The baby shower was winding down, guests beginning to make their polite exits with promises to call soon and arrange lunch dates that would never happen. Marcus was overseeing the final stages of cleanup, but Rebecca could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he was avoiding looking in her direction. She wondered if he was fighting the same internal battle she was, the desire to speak privately versus the knowledge that any contact between them could be catastrophic. "There you are," Jonathan said, appearing at her side with the inevitability of gravity. "Ready to head home? You look exhausted." "I am tired," Rebecca admitted, because it was easier than explaining that she was actually terrified, heartbroken, and feeling increasingly trapped with each passing minute. "Of course you are. Today has been overwhelming." His voice carried that particular tone of condescension that made her skin crawl. "All this excitement isn't good for you or the baby." As if on cue, Rebecca felt a sharp pain in her lower abdomen that made her gasp and double over slightly. The stress of the day, combined with the emotional upheaval, was taking its toll on her body. "Rebecca," Claire rushed to her side, genuine concern replacing the careful social politeness she'd been maintaining all afternoon. "I'm okay," Rebecca started to say, but another pain, stronger this time, cut off her words. Her hand went immediately to her belly, and she felt her daughter's movements become frantic and irregular. Dr. Patricia Webb, who had been saying goodbye to Dorothy, hurried over with the efficient authority of someone who'd handled countless pregnancy emergencies. "Let's get you somewhere quiet where I can examine you properly." "Is it the baby?" Jonathan's question carried real panic, which would have touched Rebecca if she hadn't known that his concern was more about losing his heir than losing her. "Probably just stress-induced contractions, Doctor," Webb said calmly. "But let's not take any chances. Dorothy, is there somewhere private where I can check her blood pressure and listen to the baby's heartbeat?" Dorothy gestured toward her private study, and Rebecca found herself being escorted away from the remaining guests. As they passed Marcus, she saw him start to move in their direction before catching himself, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. In Dorothy's study, Dr. Webb's examination confirmed what Rebecca had feared. Her blood pressure was elevated, and while the contractions weren't true labor, they were strong enough to cause concern. "This level of stress isn't sustainable, Doctor," Webb said quietly, checking Rebecca's pulse. "I've been monitoring your anxiety levels throughout this pregnancy, and today's readings are the highest I've seen. What's going on at home?" It was such a simple question, but Rebecca found herself unable to answer it. How could she explain that home felt like a beautiful prison, that her husband's love felt more like ownership with each passing day, that she'd built her life on a foundation of fear, and was only now realizing how unstable that foundation had become? "She's just been worried about the baby," Jonathan answered for her. "First pregnancy nerves. You know how it is." "Doctor," Webb's expression suggested she knew exactly how it was, and it wasn't what Jonathan was describing. "Rebecca, I'm going to need you to get serious about stress management. Consider it a medical necessity, not a suggestion." "Of course," Jonathan said. "Whatever she needs. We'll hire a full-time nurse if necessary, maybe arrange for bed rest." The idea of being confined to bed under Jonathan's watchful care made Rebecca's anxiety spike even higher. "Doctor," Webb must have noticed because she placed a reassuring hand on Rebecca's arm. "What I'm prescribing is emotional support and the freedom to make choices that reduce stress, not increase it. Sometimes the best medicine is honest communication about what's really causing the problem." It was as close to a direct challenge to Jonathan as a diplomatic doctor could make, and Rebecca saw his jaw tighten in response. "I think my wife and I can determine what's best for our family," he said coolly. "Of course, but as her physician, I have a responsibility to advocate for her health and the health of your daughter." The word daughter seemed to hit Jonathan like a physical blow. For a moment, his composure cracked completely, revealing something raw and possessive underneath. "My daughter," he repeated. "Yes, my daughter will have everything she needs. The best schools, the best opportunities, the best possible start in life. I won't let anyone jeopardize that, Doctor." Webb packed up her medical bag with deliberate slowness. "The best possible start in life includes a healthy, happy mother. I hope we can all agree on that priority." When they emerged from the study, Most of the guests had departed. Rebecca could see Marcus's catering van through the window, still parked in the circular drive, and her heart lurched with the knowledge that he was about to leave without them having spoken at all. "I should say goodbye to the chef," Dorothy announced. "Thank him for his exceptional service today." Rebecca watched through the window as Dorothy approached Marcus, their conversation too distant to overhear, but clearly intense. She saw Marcus shake his head at something Dorothy said, saw him gesture toward the house, saw Dorothy's posture become more aggressive and threatening. "What do you think they're discussing?" Jonathan asked, following her gaze. "Probably just final details about the invoice," Rebecca said, but her stomach churned with the certainty that the conversation was about her. A few minutes later, Dorothy returned with a satisfied expression. "All taken care of. The chef sends his regards and hopes you feel better soon." It felt like a dismissal, a closing door, a final goodbye wrapped in polite social convention. Rebecca watched Marcus's van pull away from the estate, taking with it the last remnant of the woman she used to be. "Ready to go home?" Jonathan asked, his arm sliding around her waist in a gesture that looked protective but felt possessive. As their car pulled out of the Sterling family driveway, Rebecca caught a glimpse of herself in the side mirror. She looked like a woman who'd just attended her own funeral, mourning the death of possibilities she'd been too afraid to embrace. The baby kicked weakly, as if she too was exhausted by the day's emotional turmoil. Rebecca placed both hands on her belly and made a silent promise to her daughter somehow, some way, she would find the courage to give her child a different kind of life than the one she'd chosen for herself. The question was whether that courage would come too late to matter. 3 days after the baby shower, Rebecca still couldn't shake the feeling that her life was a house of cards, waiting for the slightest breeze to bring it crashing down. She'd spent those days in a state of hypervigilance, analyzing every word Jonathan spoke, every glance Dorothy gave her, every phone call that went to voicemail. So when Marcus called her personal cell phone, a number he couldn't possibly have unless someone had given it to him, Rebecca knew the other shoe was about to drop. "Don't hang up," his voice said when she answered, the familiar timbre making her chest tighten with longing and fear in equal measure. "Please, just give me 5 minutes." "I can't do this," she whispered, glancing around their bedroom to make sure Jonathan wasn't within earshot. "You don't understand what's at stake." "I understand more than you think. I heard what he said to you at the baby shower. Rebecca, I heard how he talked to you, how he dismissed everything you believe in. That's not love. That's ownership." Rebecca sank onto the edge of their king-size bed, the silk comforter suddenly feeling like a shroud. "It's not that simple. It never is. But it's also not as complicated as you're making it. I know about the prenuptial agreement, about Dorothy's threats. I know you feel trapped." Her blood turned to ice. "How do you know about that?" "Because I made some calls after the baby shower. Because I've spent the last 10 years building the kind of success that comes with connections, resources, and the ability to protect the people I care about." "Marcus, you have to stop. If they find out you're investigating them." "Let me worry about that. What I need you to worry about is this: are you happy? Are you safe? Is this the life you want your daughter to grow up in?" The questions hit her like physical blows because she knew the answers, had known them for months but been too afraid to acknowledge them. "I have to go," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Jonathan will be home soon." "Meet me," Marcus said urgently. "Tomorrow afternoon, the coffee shop where we used to study. You remember the one. Just for an hour. Let me show you that you have options." Before she could respond, she heard Jonathan's key in the front door, his voice carrying up the stairs as he spoke to someone on his phone. "I have to go," she whispered and ended the call, deleting it from her call log with shaking fingers. But she was too late. Jonathan appeared in their bedroom doorway, his expression curious and alert. "Who was that?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Wrong number." Rebecca lied, hating herself for how easily the deception came. "Funny. It sounded like you knew whoever it was. Just someone trying to sell me something. I was trying to be polite." Jonathan studied her face for a long moment, and Rebecca forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. Finally, he nodded and moved toward their walk-in closet. "How are you feeling today? Any more of those stress contractions?" "Much better. I've been resting like Dr. Webb suggested. Good. I've been thinking about what she said, about stress management. I think we should consider hiring that full-time nurse after all. Someone who can monitor you around the clock. Make sure you and the baby are getting everything you need. Rebecca's heart sank. A full-time nurse would mean constant supervision, no privacy, no possibility of any contact with the outside world that Jonathan didn't approve of. I don't think that's necessary, she said carefully. I'm feeling much more stable now. Even so, I'd rather be safe than sorry, especially after today. What happened today? Jonathan emerged from the closet with a fresh shirt, his expression thoughtful. I had lunch with my mother. She mentioned that someone has been asking questions about our family, about you, specifically. Rebecca's mouth went dry. What kind of questions? The kind of questions that suggest someone is conducting some sort of investigation? Business associates, financial arrangements, personal history, the kind of questions that could be very dangerous if they fell into the wrong hands. The threat was clear, even wrapped in Jonathan's polite concern. Rebecca realized that Marcus's phone call had been exactly the wrong thing to do, had probably triggered whatever surveillance Dorothy had in place. I can't imagine who would be interested in investigating us, she said weakly. Can't you? Because my mother has some very interesting theories about that. Before Rebecca could respond, their doorbell rang, echoing through the house with what sounded like finality. Expecting someone, Jonathan asked, but he was already moving toward the window that overlooked their front entrance. Rebecca joined him, her heart hammering against her ribs, and saw Marcus standing on their doorstep. He was dressed casually but looked every inch the successful businessman he'd become, his posture confident despite the clearly hostile territory he'd entered. Well, Jonathan said, his voice deadly calm. This is interesting. Rebecca watched in horror as Jonathan went downstairs to answer the door. She could hear their voices carrying up from the foyer. Jonathan's politely curious, Marcus's determined but respectful. I was hoping to speak with your wife for just a few minutes. Marcus was saying, I wanted to follow up on some dietary recommendations for her final trimester. It was a reasonable cover story, the kind of professional consultation that would be completely appropriate, but Rebecca knew that Jonathan would see right through it. How thoughtful, Jonathan replied. Though I should mention that Rebecca isn't receiving visitors today. Doctor's orders. You understand. The stress of the baby shower took quite a toll on her. Of course. Perhaps I could just leave some information with you to pass along. Actually, why don't you come in? I think there are some things we should discuss. Rebecca pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a sound of pure terror. This was exactly what she'd feared, exactly what Dorothy had warned her about. Marcus was walking into a trap, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She made her way downstairs on unsteady legs, arriving in the foyer just as Jonathan was closing the front door behind Marcus. Rebecca, Marcus said, his eyes immediately going to her face, cataloging her obvious distress. I was just telling your husband that I had some nutritional recommendations for your final trimester. That's very considerate, Jonathan said smoothly. Though I have to admit, I'm curious about your sudden concern for my wife's well-being. The two men faced each other in the marble foyer, and Rebecca could feel the testosterone and barely contained aggression crackling between them like electricity before a storm. Any chef worth his reputation cares about the health of his clients. Marcus replied evenly. Clients? Is that what my wife is to you? A client? Jonathan, please, Rebecca interjected, but both men ignored her. Your wife, Marcus said, with just enough emphasis on the possessive pronoun to make it sound like a challenge, is someone I care about seeing happy and healthy. How fascinating. And what exactly makes you think she isn't happy and healthy? Stress-induced contractions at 8 months pregnant suggest otherwise. Jonathan's mask of polite interest finally slipped completely. You seem to know quite a bit about my wife's medical condition for someone who's supposed to be just a caterer. I know about it because I care about her well-being. Because unlike some people, I don't see her as a possession to be managed and controlled. The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and Rebecca saw the exact moment Jonathan's civilized facade shattered completely. Get out of my house, and he said, his voice low and dangerous. Not until I've said what I came to say. Marcus replied, turning to Rebecca. You have options. You don't have to live like this. There are people who can help you. Legal resources, financial support. That's enough, Jonathan snarled, moving toward Marcus with clear intent. Jonathan, stop, Rebecca cried, stepping between them, her hands pressed protectively over her belly. But Jonathan was beyond reason now, his face flushed with rage and humiliation. You think you can come into my house, undermine my marriage, threaten my family's stability? I think, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the obvious danger, that your wife deserves to be treated with respect and given choices about her own life. That's when Jonathan completely lost control. He grabbed Rebecca's arm, yanking her away from Marcus with such force that she stumbled, her pregnant body struggling to maintain balance. She's my wife, he hissed. My responsibility, my choice. Let go of her, Marcus said, stepping forward. I'll do whatever I want with my own wife. And then, as Rebecca tried to pull free from his grip, as she said, Jonathan, you're hurting me. He did the unthinkable. He slapped her. The sound echoed through the marble foyer like a gunshot, and for a moment, everything went completely silent. Rebecca's hand went to her cheek, shock and pain rendering her speechless. But Marcus didn't hesitate. He launched himself at Jonathan with the fury of 10 years' worth of suppressed protective instincts, and the two men went down in a tangle of limbs and rage. Rebecca pressed herself against the wall, both hands covering her belly, watching in horror as the two most important men in her life tried to destroy each other in the ruins of her carefully constructed world. And through it all, one thought echoed in her mind with crystal clarity. This was the moment everything changed. This was the moment she finally stopped pretending that her beautiful prison was actually a home. The police arrived within minutes of Rebecca's 911 call, their sirens wailing through the elite neighborhood like an announcement that the Sterling family's perfect facade had finally cracked. Rebecca sat in the back of an ambulance, her cheeks still stinging from Jonathan's slap, while paramedics checked her blood pressure and monitored the baby's heartbeat. Everything looks stable, the paramedic assured her, but we'd recommend a trip to the hospital for a full evaluation, given your advanced pregnancy and the stress of the situation. Through the ambulance's open doors, Rebecca could see Jonathan being led away in handcuffs, his carefully styled hair disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled from his fight with Marcus. He kept looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, part fury, part disbelief, as if he couldn't understand how his perfectly controlled world had spiraled so completely out of his grasp. Marcus stood nearby, speaking quietly with one of the officers, his knuckles bloodied, but his posture protective as he kept glancing toward the ambulance. He'd refused medical attention, despite the cut on his lip and what looked like the beginnings of a spectacular black eye. Dorothy arrived just as the police finished loading Jonathan into their car, her silver Mercedes screeching to a halt in the driveway. She emerged from the vehicle like an avenging angel of privilege, her Chanel suit pristine despite the circumstances, her expression a masterclass in controlled rage. This is outrageous, she declared to anyone within hearing distance. My son is a respected businessman, a pillar of this community. Whatever happened here was clearly a misunderstanding. Ma'am, your son has been arrested for domestic violence, the lead officer replied calmly. There were multiple witnesses to the assault. Witnesses? What witnesses? Dorothy's eyes swept the scene until they landed on Marcus. Oh, I see. And I suppose this man's testimony is supposed to be credible. A disgruntled former employee with obvious ulterior motives. I've never worked for your family, Marcus said quietly. And my only motive is protecting someone who couldn't protect herself. Dorothy's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. Protecting you mean destroying her marriage, her family, her child's future. You mean satisfying whatever pathetic fantasy you've been nursing for the past decade. Dorothy, that's enough. Doctor. Patricia Webb appeared at Rebecca's side, having apparently arrived with the ambulance. Rebecca needs to get to the hospital for monitoring, and this argument isn't helping anyone. Of course she needs monitoring. She's 8 months pregnant and has just witnessed her home invaded by a violent criminal. The violent criminal. Doctor, Webb interrupted with unusual sharpness, was arrested for striking a pregnant woman in the face. Let's keep our facts straight. The paramedic closed the ambulance doors, but Rebecca could still hear Dorothy's voice rising as they pulled away from what had been her home for the past 18 months. Through the rear window, she saw Marcus watching their departure, his expression a mixture of relief and determination that made her heart ache with possibility and fear in equal measure. At the hospital, the medical staff confirmed what the paramedics had told her. Both she and the baby were stable, though her blood pressure remained elevated and they wanted to keep her for observation overnight. The good news, Doctor, Webb said as she reviewed Rebecca's chart, is that your daughter seems remarkably resilient, her heart rate is strong, and she's moving normally. The bad news is that your stress levels are still dangerously high. I know, I'm trying to stay calm, but everything's falling apart. Sometimes things need to fall apart before they can be rebuilt properly. Doctor, Webb said gently, the question is, what kind of life do you want to rebuild? Before Rebecca could answer, Claire burst through the hospital room door, her face flushed from running through the corridors. I came as soon as I heard. Are you okay? Is the baby okay? Please tell me you're both safe. Rebecca started to cry then, the adrenaline of the afternoon finally giving way to the overwhelming relief of having someone who cared about her well-being without any agenda or conditions attached. We're okay, she sobbed. Physically, anyway. But Claire, I don't know what to do now. I don't know where to go, how to start over, how to protect my daughter from all of this. You start by telling the truth, Claire said firmly. All of it. About Jonathan, about Dorothy, about the prenup, about everything you've been hiding. And then when I lose everything, my daughter grows up poor, shuttled between her father's mansion and whatever tiny apartment I can afford. She learns that her mother destroyed her family for the sake of some romantic fantasy. Or, said a familiar voice from the doorway, she grows up watching her mother choose courage over fear, authenticity over security, love over control. Rebecca looked up to see Marcus standing in the hospital room entrance, his face showing the full damage from his fight with Jonathan, but his eyes bright with hope. What are you doing here? She whispered. I wanted to make sure you were okay, and I wanted to tell you something important. He stepped into the room, nodding respectfully to Dr. Webb and Claire. I've spent the last 3 days making some calls, doing some research. Rebecca, that prenuptial agreement might not be as ironclad as Dorothy led you to believe. What do you mean? Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled to what looked like a legal document. I had a lawyer friend look into it. Turns out that prenups signed under duress, or without proper legal representation, can be challenged, and prenups that leave one party completely destitute, especially when children are involved, are often deemed unconscionable by family courts. Rebecca stared at the phone screen, hardly daring to hope. But Dorothy said a lot of things that were designed to keep you scared and compliant. The truth is, you have more power than you realize, especially now that there's documented evidence of Jonathan's abuse. Claire leaned forward excitedly. The video from the baby shower? Amanda recorded Jonathan being controlling and condescending. Remember, and now there's a police report about domestic violence? Videos, police reports, medical documentation of stress-related pregnancy complications. Doctor, Webb added quietly. That's a pretty compelling case for an unsafe environment. Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope, real, tangible hope that her daughter's future wasn't predetermined by the choices Rebecca had made in fear and desperation. There's something else, Marcus continued. I know you're worried about financial security, about being able to provide for your daughter. I want you to know that whatever happens, whatever you decide, you won't be alone in this. I have resources now, connections, the ability to help you transition to independence. I can't ask you to do that. It wouldn't be fair to either of us. Marcus moved closer to her hospital bed, his expression serious. You're not asking, I'm offering, not because I expect anything in return, not because I think we can just pick up where we left off 10 years ago, but because I never stopped caring about you, and because every child deserves to grow up in a home where love isn't conditional on compliance. Rebecca looked around the hospital room at the 3 people who genuinely cared about her well-being and realized that for the first time in months, she wasn't alone. She had advocates, allies, people who saw her as more than a possession or a problem to be managed. Her daughter kicked strongly, as if approving of this new development, and Rebecca made a decision that had been 10 years in the making. "I want to fight," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "I want to fight for my daughter's future, for my own future. I want to stop being afraid." "Then we fight," Claire said immediately. "Together," Marcus added, "with medical documentation of the toll this marriage has taken on both you and your child." "Doctor," Webb concluded. For the first time since her champagne glass had shattered at the baby shower, Rebecca felt like she could breathe properly. The road ahead would be difficult, possibly devastating, certainly expensive and emotionally draining, but at least it would be real. 6 weeks later, Rebecca sat in a cozy apartment across town, watching her daughter sleep in the bassinet beside her bed. Hope Sterling she'd kept Jonathan's surname for legal simplicity, though she was considering changing it had arrived 2 weeks early, but healthy and perfect. Her entrance into the world as dramatic as everything else that had happened since the baby shower. The apartment was small compared to the Sterling mansion, but it felt like a palace to Rebecca because every corner of it was hers. She'd chosen the furniture, picked the paint colors, decided where to hang the photographs Claire had helped her select from her college years. For the first time in her adult life, her living space reflected her personality rather than someone else's vision of what she should want. Marcus knocked softly on the door, as he did every morning, carrying coffee and whatever pastry he'd decided to experiment with that day. He'd temporarily closed his restaurants to focus on helping her through the legal proceedings, a decision that had shocked the culinary world and touched Rebecca more deeply than she could express. "How's our girl today?" he asked, setting the coffee on her small kitchen table and peering into the bassinet with the gentle awe that hadn't faded since Hope's birth. "She slept for 3 whole hours straight," Rebecca reported. "I'm starting to think she might actually be human." Marcus laughed quietly, careful not to wake the baby. "The pediatrician said that's normal for preemies. Her sleep schedule should regulate in another few weeks." It was strange, Rebecca thought, how naturally Marcus had stepped into this supportive role. He wasn't trying to be Hope's father, that biological reality belonged to Jonathan, with all its legal complications, but he'd become something equally important, a constant, reliable presence who asked for nothing but offered everything. The legal battle had been vicious, exactly as Rebecca had expected. Dorothy had deployed a team of expensive attorneys who tried every tactic from character assassination to claims of parental alienation. But Amanda Foster's video from the baby shower, combined with the police report and Dr. Webb's medical documentation, had created a compelling case for Rebecca's claims of emotional abuse and an unsafe environment. The turning point had come when Jonathan, desperate to maintain his political ambitions, had hired a publicist to spin the story as a case of postpartum depression, making his wife irrational. The strategy had backfired spectacularly when Dr. Webb testified that Rebecca's symptoms had begun long before pregnancy and were consistent with someone living under prolonged psychological stress. "Any word from your lawyer?" Marcus asked, settling into the chair across from her with his own coffee. "Settlement conference is scheduled for next week. Claire thinks Jonathan's team is finally ready to negotiate seriously." The prenuptial agreement had indeed been deemed unenforceable, exactly as Marcus had predicted, combined with evidence of domestic violence and the court's commitment to ensuring Hope's best interests. Rebecca was looking at a settlement that would provide genuine financial security, not the kind of wealth she'd known as Jonathan's wife, but enough to raise her daughter independently. And the custody arrangement, Rebecca's expression tightened. This was the part that still kept her awake at night. "Supervised visitation for now, unsupervised once he completes anger management therapy, but primary custody stays with me." It was more than she'd dared hope for 6 weeks ago, but it still meant that Hope would grow up shuttling between two worlds, trying to navigate the complicated reality of having parents who couldn't be in the same room together. Marcus reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "She's going to be okay, Rebecca. She's going to grow up knowing she has a mother who fought for her, who chose her well-being over her own comfort. That's not nothing." "I know. It's just, I wanted to give her a perfect family, the kind of stability I never had growing up. Maybe perfect families are overrated. Maybe what kids really need is authenticity, love that doesn't come with conditions, and parents who model courage instead of conformity." Rebecca looked down at their joined hands. thinking about how different her life looked now compared to 6 weeks ago. She'd lost the mansion, the designer clothes, the social status that had come with being a Sterling, but she'd gained something more valuable, the freedom to make choices based on what felt right rather than what felt safe. Hope stirred in her bassinet, making the small mewing sounds that meant she was about to wake up hungry and demanding. Rebecca stood to pick her up, marveling as she did every time at her daughter's perfect miniature features, the way her tiny hand instinctively curled around Rebecca's finger. "I've been thinking," Marcus said as Rebecca settled back into her chair with the baby, "about what comes next, for all of us." "What do you mean?" "I mean that I've been closed for 6 weeks, which is probably long enough. My investors are getting nervous, and I miss cooking, but I also don't want to go back to the way things were before." Rebecca felt her chest tighten with anxiety. "Are you saying you want to get back to your normal life? Because I understand, Marcus. This isn't what you signed up for when you decided to help me." "Actually, it's exactly what I signed up for. But I want to make sure we're both clear about what that means going forward." He leaned back in his chair, studying her face with the same intensity he'd once used to perfect his recipes. "I've been thinking about opening a new restaurant. Something smaller, more personal, a place that focuses on the kind of food that brings people together, that tells stories about love and second chances and the courage to start over." "That sounds wonderful. I want you to be part of it, as a partner, not just emotional support. I want your food blog background, your understanding of how to write about cuisine in a way that connects with people. I want your input on the menu, the atmosphere, the entire concept." Rebecca stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You want to work together. I want to build something together, something that's ours, that reflects both of our experiences, our growth, our understanding of what really matters." Hope finished nursing and looked up at her mother with the kind of direct gaze that newborns weren't supposed to be capable of, as if she was listening to the conversation and waiting to see what her mother would decide. "What about us?" Rebecca asked quietly. "I mean, personally, I can't just pick up where we left off 10 years ago. I'm not the same person I was then, and I have responsibilities now that I didn't have before." Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his battered face into something beautiful. "I don't want to pick up where we left off. I want to start fresh, with who we are now, with full knowledge of what we've both been through. I want to build something new, something better, something that includes hope and honors the fact that we're both different people than we were at 23. Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in months, they were tears of joy rather than fear or desperation. "So what do you think?" Marcus asked. "Ready to take another leap of faith, this time together?" Rebecca looked down at her daughter, then around at the small apartment that had become their sanctuary, then back at Marcus, who was offering her something she'd thought was gone forever, the possibility of love without conditions, partnership without power struggles, a future built on authenticity rather than security. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. "I'm ready," Hope gurgled contentedly, as if she approved of the decision. And Rebecca realized that sometimes the most important recipes weren't for food at all. They were for life. Take equal parts courage and hope. Add a generous helping of support from people who truly care about you. Season with hard-won wisdom, and mix until you create something entirely new. Something that was finally, authentically yours. 1 year later, Rebecca stood in the kitchen of Second Chances, the restaurant she and Marcus had opened 6 months earlier, putting the finishing touches on Hope's first birthday cake. It was a simple vanilla cake with strawberry frosting, but she decorated it with delicate sugar flowers that had taken her 3 days to perfect. The restaurant hummed with controlled chaos around her as Marcus's staff prepared for the lunch rush. Second Chances had become exactly what they'd envisioned, a place where comfort food met gourmet technique, where every dish told a story about resilience, renewal, and the courage to start over. Rebecca's food blog about her experiences, Cooking Through Crisis, had become a book that debuted on the New York Times bestseller list. The advance in royalties, combined with her divorce settlement, had given her the financial independence she'd dreamed of. But more importantly, it had given her a voice and a platform to help other women in similar situations. How's the birthday girl? Claire asked, emerging from the dining room where she'd been helping set up for Hope's party. Currently destroying her high chair with what I think used to be mashed sweet potatoes. Rebecca replied, wiping frosting off her hands. I swear she gets more food on herself than in her mouth. That's what one-year-olds do. It's like their primary job description. Through the kitchen's pass-through window, Rebecca could see the dining room filling with guests. It was a small gathering compared to the elaborate baby shower a year ago, just the people who truly mattered. Dr. Webb was there with her husband. Amanda Foster had brought her teenage daughter, and even some of Marcus's restaurant staff had stayed after their shift to celebrate. Notably absent were Jonathan and Dorothy. The custody arrangement allowed Jonathan's supervised visits with Hope twice a week, but Rebecca had made it clear that major celebrations would happen in her world, with her chosen family. Jonathan had protested through his lawyers, but the family court had supported Rebecca's position that a child's birthday party didn't constitute a required visitation. She's gotten so big, Claire marveled, watching Hope through the doorway as she babbled happily in her high chair, completely covered in orange sweet potato. I can't believe it's been a year. The longest and shortest year of my life, Rebecca said, carrying the finished cake toward the dining room. Sometimes it feels like the baby shower happened yesterday, and sometimes it feels like a completely different lifetime. It had been different in every way that mattered. The woman who'd stood in the Sterling family ballroom, terrified of losing her beautiful prison, had evolved into someone Rebecca barely recognized, confident, independent, genuinely happy for the first time in years. The transformation hadn't been easy. The first few months after Hope's birth had been a whirlwind of legal battles, sleepless nights, and the overwhelming responsibility of single motherhood. There had been moments when Rebecca had wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake, if she should have stayed in her comfortable cage rather than venturing into the uncertain world of authentic living. But then Hope would smile, or Marcus would bring her coffee exactly the way she liked it, or she'd get an email from a reader whose life had been changed by her book, and Rebecca would remember why she'd chosen truth over security. Rebecca. Tommy Hayes, Marcus's 8-year-old son from his previous relationship, came running into the kitchen with the unbounded energy that only children possessed. Dad says it's almost time to light the candles. Tommy had been Rebecca's biggest surprise in this new life. She'd worried about how Marcus's son would react to her presence. But Tommy had embraced both her and Hope with the enthusiastic acceptance that came so naturally to children. He'd become Hope's self-appointed big brother, always wanting to help feed her, read to her, or show her his latest Lego creation. Then we better get this cake out there before someone gets impatient, Rebecca said, ruffling Tommy's hair affectionately. As they processed into the dining room, carrying the cake like a ceremonial offering, Rebecca caught Marcus's eye across the room. He was holding Hope, who had been cleaned up and dressed in a frilly pink dress that she was already trying to remove, and his expression when he looked at Rebecca was everything she'd thought she'd given up 10 years ago, pure, uncomplicated love. Happy birthday to you. The small gathering began to sing, and Hope clapped her hands with delight, not understanding the words but responding to the joy in everyone's voices. Rebecca set the cake on the table in front of her daughter and helped her blow out the single candle, making a wish of her own that Hope would grow up knowing that love came in many forms, that family was defined by choice as much as biology, and that sometimes the scariest decisions led to the most beautiful destinations. Speech, Tommy called out, apparently having appointed himself the party's master of ceremonies. I'm not much of a speech maker, Rebecca protested, but Marcus handed Hope to Claire and moved to stand beside her. Actually, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the small dining room, I think this is the perfect time for both of us to say something. Rebecca looked at him in confusion, but he just smiled and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box that made her heart stop completely. A year ago, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, we found our way back to each other under the worst possible circumstances. We've spent the last 12 months learning who we are now, how we fit together, what kind of life we want to build. Rebecca was dimly aware that the room had gone completely silent, that even Hope had stopped babbling to watch the proceedings with the intuitive attention that children brought to important moments. I don't want to replace Hope's father, Marcus continued, and I'm not trying to recreate what we had in college. What I want is to build something entirely new with the woman you've become, the mother you are, the partner you've proven yourself to be. He dropped to one knee, right there in the middle of their restaurant, surrounded by the people who'd supported them through the hardest year of their lives. Rebecca Sterling, will you marry me? Will you let me be part of this beautiful, complicated, authentic life you've created? Will you help me show Tommy and Hope what love looks like when it's built on choice instead of fear, on partnership instead of possession? Rebecca stared down at him, this man who'd waited 10 years for her to find her courage, who'd risked his own success to help her escape her golden cage, who'd never asked her to be anyone other than exactly who she was. Yes, she said, tears streaming down her face as the small crowd erupted in cheers. Yes, but only if you promise me something. Marcus slipped the ring onto her finger, a simple solitaire that was everything her first engagement ring hadn't been chosen with love, instead of purchased for display, and stood to face her. Anything. Promise me we'll never stop choosing each other, every single day. Promise me we'll never let comfort make us complacent, or success make us forget what really matters. Marcus cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. I promise we'll keep choosing love over fear, truth over convenience, and each other over anything that tries to come between us. When he kissed her, Rebecca felt something she'd never experienced in her first marriage, complete certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the right person, at exactly the right moment in her life. Hope squealed with delight and clapped her sticky hands, as if she understood that something wonderful had just happened. Tommy whooped and announced to everyone that he was going to have a mom and a sister, which made everyone laugh and cry at the same time. Later, after the guests had gone home and the restaurant had been cleaned, Rebecca sat in the kitchen nursing Hope while Marcus did the final inventory for the day. It was a scene of domestic contentment that would have seemed impossible a year ago, a peaceful end to a perfect day, surrounded by evidence of the life they'd built together. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Dorothy hadn't hired you for the baby shower? Rebecca asked quietly. Marcus looked up from his clipboard, considering the question seriously. Sometimes, but then I remember that some things are meant to happen, even if the path to them is messy and painful. You think we were meant to find our way back to each other? I think, Marcus said, setting down his inventory and moving to sit beside her, that we were meant to become the people we needed to be in order to build this life together. The Rebecca I fell in love with in college was wonderful, but she wasn't ready for this. And the Marcus who let you go wasn't strong enough to fight for what mattered. Rebecca leaned against his shoulder, feeling Hope's weight in her arms, listening to the quiet sounds of their restaurant settling into nighttime stillness. I'm glad Dorothy hired you, she said finally. I'm glad that champagne glass shattered and forced me to face everything I'd been avoiding. I'm glad Jonathan showed his true colors before Hope got old enough to think that's what love looks like. Even though it was terrifying. Especially because it was terrifying. The best decisions usually are. Marcus kissed the top of her head, a gesture that managed to encompass Hope as well. So what do you think? Mama ready for the next adventure? Rebecca looked around at their restaurant, their life, their chosen family, and felt the same sense of possibility that had sustained her through the darkest moments of the past year. With you, I'm ready for anything. Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars, full of promise and potential. Inside, Hope finished nursing and settled into sleep with the absolute trust that only came from knowing you were completely safe and unconditionally loved. And Rebecca realized that this was what happiness actually looked like, not a pristine ballroom or a designer dress or the security of a trust fund, but a messy kitchen at the end of a long day, surrounded by people who saw you clearly and chose to love you anyway. It had taken her 30 years and the destruction of everything she thought she wanted to discover what she actually needed. But some recipes, she reflected as she carried her sleeping daughter toward home, were worth the wait, and that's how a shattered champagne glass led to a shattered life, and ultimately, to a life worth living. Rebecca learned that sometimes the most terrifying decisions lead to the most beautiful destinations, and that it's never too late to choose love over fear. What did you think of Rebecca's journey? Have you ever had to choose between security and authenticity? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing your perspectives on these life-changing moments. If this story moved you, hit that like button, Share it with someone who might need to hear Rebecca's message of courage. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about second chances, finding your voice, and the power of choosing yourself. Until next time, remember, your authentic life is always worth fighting for.